And welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Life from the Inside Out with Kris. And last time we talked about inner weather and some of the deeper meanings behind weather and some of the inner symbols. And I'm here with Serge and getting ready for this episode. How you doing, Serge?
I am very well, thank you very much. Sitting up here in Toronto in our winter.
Yeah. Sounds nice. Yeah, we're about to go experience some winter ourselves. Getting up into the mountains, so it sounds nice.
Cool.
Yeah, I think we talked a little bit before getting live here, about the potential to talk some about feeling tones and how that those are tied to probabilities. So could be interesting to see if that's something that Kris gets into or if he's got something different planned for today.
Yeah, we can certainly find out. And why don't we do just that?
All right.
Now we trust that you are comfortable.
Oh, very comfortable. Thanks, Kris.
Indeed. And we thank you for your consideration.
Oh, thanks as well.
So you were mentioning probabilities. A most interesting subject of discussion. Everyone, to varying degrees, flows in and out of particular life situations, which in themselves derive from the varieties of attitudes, expectations, belief systems, your assumptions, whatever narrative that you are running through your mind. And this does not necessarily apply strictly to the thought that you are conscious of at this very moment, though that may also be a significant factor. But there are always narratives, just like a ticker going through the back of your mind, various kinds of dialogues. And each of these stem from numerous ideas that you try to entertain at any given time. But your constructs of time and space are extremely narrow. They are very, very tightly controlled. So it is sometimes difficult for you to just allow a greater life experience to be part of your living situation. Everything is truly controlled by you to keep the consensus reality flowing according to the terms that you have all agreed upon. Hence, it is called a consensus reality. But in and out and through all of these trappings, there flows a constant series of threads. You can refer them as probable realities that you can tune into at any given time. It does not mean that your particular reality will be superseded or superimposed. Everything flows according to those notions that you have. The ideas that you entertain, the ones especially that you decide to grab onto, to focus upon or pay attention to, draw particular probabilities into the actualization of your daily experience. This goes on literally unseen, just so that your pretty packaged concept of time, space, personality, ID, or identity are not overly upset, because you do like to think that everything runs according to a particular order, an order that you have established. But there are other kinds of experiences that you can have, and hence you refer to them as probabilities. There are other probable events, all waiting in the wings, and they will come to the forefront according to what you decide to focus upon. You may find yourself driving to work and say you are accustomed to taking a regular route every day. But this one day you decide, instead of turning right, you will turn left. And you may have some other kinds of experiences, whatever they be, is up to you. Or you may decide to not go to work that day, and other kinds of experiences follow through. You may decide to park somewhere else during that morning for some other kind of event. What they are is up to you. What is interesting is that you can play with this concept to quite some degree and still reap benefits and fulfillment. You are not fated to the same thing day in, day out. So these desires to suddenly turn left or turn right, if you're accustomed to the opposite, come from impulses. And impulses could very, very likely be attributed to certain probabilities might be more beneficial for you today than the standard that you're accustomed to. It may want to let you know there are specific benefits and experiences and fulfillment to be had were you to do something different today. Now, of course, you are also entirely free to decide not to. That is the nature of an impulse. You can follow it or not. And you might actually decide you will follow through in an impulse only to decide, no, I will go over here instead, following an additional impulse. So that can create a very nice set of plays on the notion of time and even who you are, because you may not necessarily notice that with every particular situation or event, you think of yourself as the same person, but the different sets of characteristics or traits might come to the surface, some subtle, perhaps some not so subtle. And they as well are part of the larger construct of the personality. So it is the personality in its larger theme, not just the self that you know as the ego, but the larger self plays just like a juggler may juggle his things. You play with these probabilities in very much the same way to see what kind of benefits may come to the forefront. And even in some difficult situations, this still has an prominent place in your lives. So your life is filled with these. You are perhaps familiar with the Stockdale paradox. Admiral Stockdale was captured during the Vietnam War with his men, thrown into Viet Cong prisons, a prisoner of war where they were tortured daily. Many people held the firm conviction, regardless of the hellish conditions that they were undergoing and the pain that one day they would get out, if not tomorrow, the week after, if not the week after, perhaps the month after. They always held that strong conviction. Those that did according to the study, the majority of those that held the strong conviction that regardless they would walk out of that situation and continue to live, made it out. Those prisoners who were convinced of the fatality of their situation, that they would surely die before any help or rescue comes their way, apparently perished. And we only bring this up because the Stockdale paradox, in a manner of speaking, ties into not only what you would call a great hope, but a firm conviction that regardless of the reality of the situation they were facing, even of its hellish nature in that way, they still held strongly to the notion that they would eventually walk away with their lives. So this is an example of certain sets of probabilities that were strongly adhered to. The conviction of their walking away with their lives was so strong in spite of their present situation. They never gave up on it. They kept always going back to their certainty that at some point in time they would go. Does that make some sense to you?
Yeah, I follow it. I think it speaks to the strength of having those kind of expectations.
Indeed, they did not waver, even though their present situation was horrendous. They still firmly maintained, firmly believed, they expected that at some point in time, if not tomorrow or next week or next month, they would walk out. And we only bring it into the discussion about probabilities because they always brought into the present moment the conviction, the expectation that they would indeed survive their ordeal. And that is perhaps an extreme example, but it is very poignant and very useful. Some people are ready to quit just a few minutes into a difficult situation, and they might even recognize that there is a strong drive within them to keep going forward, as it were, to keep their chin up, to not allow the present situation to bring them down. It does require some practice. But these men literally had nothing to lose at this point except their lives. So they held on to it, not just as a dream, not just as a false hope, but as a truth. And we're not talking here about any form of religion, but we are simply talking about that sheer, powerful human conviction that what they expected was what will happen. This is their expectation. And they had it in the here and now. And that is also another interesting angle. Now, You like eagles,
Yep.
indeed. They are fascinating creatures. They can fly and ride air currents up to and perhaps even beyond 10,000 feet. There are other creatures, other kinds of raptor like birds that can even fly higher, up to 30 and more thousand feet. Magnificent creatures. Now, what do you think will happen if, through some quirk of nature, an eagle egg happens to find its way into a chicken's nest? And the chicken nurses the egg and it hatches and it is raised amongst the chickens. What will happen to that eagle?
Well, I don't really know. I guess if I had to guess, it would it might not learn to fly? Would it act like a chicken, or would it learn to fly anyhow? I don't
If
know.
it is raised by chickens in the chicken house, surrounded by hens and roosters who cluck and do whatever they do, whatever chickens do, scratch the ground and so on, that eagle will not fly because it has not been raised that way. It does not have that information available to it. It may even look at eagles into the sky and wonder, oh, wouldn't it be nice if I could fly like that? And of course, it would be ridiculed by the other chickens. They would simply say, oh, come now, you're a chicken. Chickens don't fly. They may flap their wings, but they do not fly high into the sky. Get real. So that eagle will not fly. It will not be able to conceive of that potential. We bring that up simply because many individuals, not everyone, but many individuals, are brought up to follow the rules and regulations, spoken and unspoken, but strongly implied, and physically articulated or physicalized about all the limitations and the rules of limitations that the individual has to follow. The ideas handed down through the generations. If especially you are born in a family, and again, we must state this does not apply to everyone, but to a large percentage of the population, say, that are born in a family that may not have everything at their disposal. Perhaps they have some form of poverty. They have ideas about one's nature as being unable to do this or to do that, just like the eagle finding itself in the chicken house, raised by the chickens. Some people become convinced through familial and ancestral narratives that one is never smart enough, one is never rich enough, one is never beautiful enough, one can never be loved, or is simply not lovable, or cannot love properly. In that respect, such an individual will limit the potential of probabilities to flow in and out of its life. Its choices become extremely narrow. almost psychologically and emotionally boxed in. And this becomes the result of the things that they hold to be true about themselves and others. So it creates another kind of struggle in the personality. And again, like the eagle chicken, it may see others literally fly above the clouds in one form or another and is convinced that this is just not for him. He is just a chicken after all. Cannot see himself in any other light. And again, that really limits the range of probabilities available to such an individual. Still, probabilities available, but not to the same degree as someone who may have been born in an affluent situation, and so on and so forth. Does that make some sense to you?
Yeah, yeah, I follow you, Kris. And
So, what does one do as the Stockdale paradox exemplifies? One can persevere, one can educate themselves beyond the narrow limitations of their original programming. One can educate themselves through educational systems, read, read, and associate with individuals who actually take the time to break down any barriers or balls and chain systems so that they have more probabilities available to them and can flourish in ways that are well beyond what was expected of them. That is the whole point. Not just what was expected of them, but what they originally expected of themselves. And that is the whole key. What do you expect of yourselves? Just like Admiral Stockdale, regardless of the dire situation he and his men were found in, or they found themselves in, they fully expect that they would overcome this. And the ordinary individual, of course, is not in a prisoner of war camp by the Viet Cong. So they have far more opportunities available to them. And they can, in this way, educate themselves beyond the narrow limitations that were literally offered to them from their familial narrative. And that is so incredibly important. How to break those molds, break those chains that have held you down. Bemoaning your situation is not going to solve anything, but educating yourself, especially exploring the potential of attitudes and expectations, moving away from any attitude and sets of expectations that keep you in the same mindset, and then start acquiring an entirely new set of attitudes and expectations that free you from wherever you were into what you are becoming. Does that make some sense to you?
Yes, it does. I think we're getting maybe close to an end of a episode here too, but it
Indeed.
reminds me of the book Jonathan Livingston Seagull, where he's taught that as a seagull, all they're supposed to do is to be sort of hovering around the boats looking for scraps, from the fishing boats. And he kind of discovers has wings and is like, well, what do I do with these wings? And becomes interested in flying. And then eventually, he becomes so different from the flock that he's kicked out and becomes outcast, and just kind of concentrates on flying. But it reminds me a little of that story as well. The idea.
Indeed, in some respect, everyone has a Jonathan Livingston Seagull side to their personality. Some choose to abide by the rules of the flock. Others discover that they can still soar without the flock. And if the flock weighs you down, you can flock the flock.
Well, don't mean to give it away too, but they create their own new flock that's interested in flying as well.
They are birds, and all birds have feathers, and feathers stick together, whether on the same bird or with others.
I like it.
Indeed. Please take your break.
Thanks, Kris.